guys, it's Nicole. Welcome back. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I feed all of my orchids, what kind of fertilizer I use, what mistakes I've made in the past with other fertilizers, and what I've learned in the last couple of years since I've been growing orchids. So I'm going to show you some additions that I make to my nutrient solution for my orchids. I'm going to show you progress on a few of them so you could see how they've done with how I'm feeding them. So jumping right in, I use a MSU fertilizer. So the MSU fertilizer is a formula that was made by the Michigan State University, which has a good mixture of different nutrients. So in this fertilizer here, we've got nitrogen, phosphate, potassium, calcium, and magnesium, as well as iron and manganese, and a few other micronutrients. So I use this fertilizer just because it's more well balanced, and it's got other nutrients that some of the general fertilizers don't have. So I used to use this Miracle Grow fertilizer for years, and I followed the instructions to the T. And then later on in my orchid growing journey, I found that it didn't have magnesium or calcium. So if you use something like this, which is readily available in garden centers, you may have to supplement with calcium and magnesium. It is a nutrient that orchids need. I no longer use this for this reason. And if I do use it again, I will be supplementing with calcium and magnesium. So the MSU fertilizer has 13% nitrogen. It's got 16% potassium, 8% calcium, and 2.6% magnesium. It's also got 3.7% phosphoric acid. And then it's got a bunch of micronutrients, including iron, manganese, zinc, copper, boron, and molybdenum. And I do use that fertilizer just because it does have those extra nutrients that the Miracle Grow fertilizer doesn't have. I tend to I don't actually follow the instructions exactly. So I try to feed more often, but what I do is I feed a weaker solution. So they instruct you to use 3/4 of a teaspoon every time you feed, 3 times per month, and then you flush 1 time per month. Instead, what I do is I feed around 1/3 to 1/4 strength every single feeding. So I keep it a little bit lighter, and I make a couple of adjustments. So I also use slow release fertilizer. So I use a very weak dilute solution, but I add this slow release fertilizer to some orchids that are more heavier feeders. So I add a couple of beads to my mixture for Phalaenopsis or for Catasetums or for Vanda orchids that may need a little bit more of a boost. And that way I could still feed my dilute nutrient solution every time I water to all of my orchids, but by adding the slow release fertilizer, I'm giving my orchids a little bit more of what they need. In terms of my tap water, it's pretty darn good. So my tap water has between 30 and 40 parts per million, which is not bad at all. So I don't use distilled water. I don't need a reverse osmosis system. So I just use straight up tap water, and I do alter my pH slightly. So I want to make sure that my orchids are receiving a pH of between 5.5 and 6.5. I aim for 6. And reason for this being is that I do have some orchids in semi-hydroponics, and those orchids, they need to receive the nutrients at a certain pH because the bark and sphagnum moss and other organic mixes are naturally acidic, and they naturally change and alter the pH to an optimal pH that you need. And if you look at the nutrient availability charts, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, they're not available at all pH levels. So the optimal place for your nutrients to get absorbed by your orchid are between 5.5 and 6.5. For instance, magnesium will not get absorbed at a pH level of 4.5, for instance. You don't have much available. So the goal here is to make sure that you have a pH level where all of the nutrition that the orchid needs is readily available. So without further lead in, let me show you exactly how I fertilize these orchids. So what I normally do is I have a watering can here. I will put it to the side so you don't need to see it really. And what I do is, as I mentioned, I do a third of a teaspoon to a fourth of a teaspoon. I keep it quite light. So this is about maybe a fourth of a teaspoon. I'm gonna add it to my watering tin. And then I normally add that to my water. And then what I generally do is I alternate between using the SuperThrive solution, which I think works nicely for me, and clean kelp. So I think if you are growing orchids, it's nice to alternate some different add-ins just because it gives the orchid different kinds of solutions every time you water, and you're sort of giving them different vitamins. It's like eating, like think about it like you may eat spinach one day, you may eat sweet potatoes another day. They all have different sorts of vitamins, and they give you what you need. So if you eat the same thing every time, you might be deficient in certain things. The fertilizer takes care of that because it does have quite a lot of different nutrients within the mix. But when I'm adding add-ins like kelp, which help promote root growth, I like to change up these add-ins. So what I do here is I'm going to just put it in on the side. I end up adding 5 milliliters of the kelp mix right into the my watering can, which is a gallon. 4, 5. And then I mix it in with lukewarm water, and I'm going to mix it in with water, and I'll be right back. So I've added water to my nutrient solution. So this includes the MSU Fertilizer as well as the clean kelp. And I just followed the instructions on the clean kelp, and that is for growth for the root system. Now the next thing I usually do is I take my little test pH indicator. I take some of that water and I like to test it out by seeing how the pH level is. So I take some water directly from the solution, and what I do here, let me show you, is I take the pH test indicator and I pour it right into the little test tube here, just to see where I'm at with the pH level. And each color correlates with a certain pH. So I'm shaking it up, and I see this pale yellow color. So it looks like that is the pH of 6, so I'm pretty good here. So if this were to come out a little bit more red, I'd increase the pH and add a couple of drops of the pH up or the pH down. All you need is like maybe 2 or 3 drops. My pH meter needs to be calibrated, so I'm not able to use it at the moment, but I do use this test indicator in lieu of my pH meter. Now taking a look at the actual TDS meter, I'm going to take a look to see how many parts per million are in here. So let me turn this on. So as I mentioned, my tap water is generally at 39. And after looking at this, looks like we've got a reading of 160, which is great. So that 160 part per million is around what I'm looking for. I look for about 150 parts per million. I'll say that in summertime, I do add a little bit more fertilizer. So instead of 1/3 or 1/4 strength, I may bump this up by half because that's when the orchids are growing the most. And in terms of how I water, I use a 1-gallon container here. And then when the orchids are in bark or sphagnum moss, what I do is I pour the water straight through the pot. And I let it drain completely over the sink. So I'm saturating the orchid and making sure that the medium is completely soaked through. And what I do with my semi-hydroponic orchids is I empty out the container at the end of the week, and I tend to flush them pretty regularly. So I like to flush with water just to make sure there's no accumulated salts. And then I pour the nutrient solution mix directly into the self-watering container so that it goes up and fills up the reservoir. So I usually have a wick that brings the moisture up into the pot. And when I'm pouring it over the pot, it is drenching the leca and giving a consistent and constant source of moisture. Again, the slow fertilizer helps me because then I'm using the same nutrient solution across all of my plants, but it helps me because any heavy feeders, I'm giving them exactly what they need. So by giving them a little bit of slow release fertilizer, I know they're getting fed a little bit more. So that helps me along with everything. And again, I like to alternate between the clean kelp and the SuperThrive just because each one does something a little bit different, and I like to see I like to alternate and give them different nutrients. And I repotted a bunch of cattleyas, a bunch of seedlings that I got from Carmela Orchids 4 months ago. I repotted them right before the 4th of July, and let me show you a couple of them, how they're doing. So these are 2 of the cattleyas that I got over the summer. I repotted them right before July 4th. So they've been repotted for, it's been 4 months, and the root system on these went absolutely insane. So as you can see here, the roots are going right through the bottom of the pot, and they're pretty crowded in here. So I'm very excited to see the progress. I do think I'm getting the nutrients right. I do have 3 new growths that have popped up. So here's 2, and this one was growing when I first got it. So I'm sure that this orchid is going to do just fine. Just the root growth alone for me, I think, is quite insane. I'm going to have a very hard time when it comes to repotting this, but this is how I've been feeding this orchid. I literally take my my watering tin and I just pour it right over, let it drain right over the sink, maybe twice a week, depends on how long it takes for this medium to get dry. And let me show you the other Cattleya orchid. So this one is quite similar. So all of my Cattleyas sort of look like this. They've grown right through the pots. This has been here for 4 months. Lots of new root growth all over. A new growth initiating right there. So I just snapped the root, unfortunately. It's just growing through the pot like mad. So this one's in a mixture of bark and sphagnum moss, like the rest of my Cattleyas. So I think the most important thing to call out here is when you are fertilizing your orchids, you want to make sure that you're using a dilute nutrient solution. Some folks use heavier concentrations. When I first started growing my orchids, I was using the Miracle Grow mix, and I followed the instructions to the T, and I found that a lot of my roots were burned. So that's when I started reading up more about this, that, you know, the mixture was a little too strong. So I use a lighter feeding weekly. I do boost the nutrient solution when it comes to the grow season. So in the summertime, I will double what I'm feeding. So instead of quarter or a third strength, I may use half strength for a couple of months in the summer. And then very important is you need to flush your pots regularly, whether they're in bark or whether they're in leca. Once a month, I like to take just pure tap water. My tap water is, as I mentioned, pretty good, only between 30 and 40 parts per million in the water. And I just completely flush my pot. And what I mean by that is I run water through the entire pot until it's completely drenched and running through. So I let it run through maybe 30 seconds and it gets rid of the accumulated salts. And this is really important, especially for orchids that are in leca, just because they can get a salty buildup at the top, and that's very harsh for the roots. Anyhow, I hope this video was helpful. Thanks for stopping by, and I will catch you guys soon. Bye.